Now, you know I railed against the ban on Australians returning from India early last week. Even before the government imposed the ban, I warned that what some people were calling for would be un-Australian. And the reason I argued this was pretty simple. First, the risk argument. The rate of infection in India is still below what the US and the UK had late last year. And we never banned Aussies coming home from those countries. And everyone's going through quarantine anyway when they get here for 14 days. That's what quarantine is there for. And second, the rights argument. Your Australian passport, your citizenship is supposed to be the golden ticket. It guarantees you a right to come home. Or so we thought. Now, as I said, cricketers shouldn't get special treatment, and their whingers when they went over to India to make big money ring a bit hollow, sure. But the principle for them remains the same as for others. They have a right to come home. Anyway, that's why the government went ahead and they imposed the ban anyway. I opposed it and I told you it left me wondering what sort of a paranoid, selfish country we're becoming. And then after we went to air on Friday night, we learned about the threats of prosecutions and jail terms for any Australians trying to get back, trying to get around this ban and get back to their own country. The talk about new quarantine facilities, by the way, is a distraction. Our hotel quarantine system has worked just fine. So long as we bring people back, there's always going to be the odd cross-infection, and clearly we can handle that, as New South Wales has done for the vast bulk of Australians coming home over the past year. Now, I just want to emphasise the point about why on earth we've singled out India. Last year, at their peaks, the US and UK had new infection rates, daily infection rates of about 1,000 people per million. India is still nowhere near that, closer to about 300 infections per million people. You can see this graph tracking daily infection rates. And the US and UK were skyrocketing towards the end of last year over their winter, whereas India, while rates are rising sharply now, is well behind. Yet we block returns from India now, not from the US or the UK last year. Now, this is difficult to justify, especially since we now have much better treatments for coronavirus. We know a lot more about it, so that fatality rates in developed countries have plummeted. And also, especially because we now have vaccines. More than 2 million of the most vulnerable Australians have now been vaccinated. Yet even when we look at cumulative cases per million, India's dire problem is dwarfed by other countries like Brazil and Spain, where there's no ban on travel for Australians coming home, of course. Nobody from government has gone close to being able to explain this different approach for India. I know most of the public supports the Prime Minister. On this show, I give you my considered view, not what I hope will be popular. So this policy is supported in the same way that most people in the various states backed their premiers and their harmful, unnecessary lockdowns this year. Scott Morrison knows that politically, the India policy is fine.
This is a decision that is being taken both in the interests of keeping Australians safe now, but also to put us in a stronger position to safely bring more Australians home. So I respectfully disagree with the critics on this one, but the buck stops here when it comes to these decisions, and I'm going to take decisions that I believe are going to protect Australia from a third wave.
Yeah, people are frightened. The media and politicians continue to talk about every infection as a big story, terribly scary, even though in 99% of cases the symptoms are mild or non-existent. Hardly anyone has been sick from COVID in Australia all year. I think the reason we're seeing a ban on India is a kind of unintentional discrimination against them because they're a developing country, because their medical system is overwhelmed, because they're suffering terribly, and we can see that it looks horrible on television. So bizarrely, we're making it harder for Australians to get out of there and come home from that horrible situation. It's cultural too, let's be frank. The funeral pyres look horrible to us because we're not used to that as the standard funeral practice that it is in India. Now, this is not to downplay the trauma in India. What's happening there is a tragedy. It's on a par with what we saw in Europe and North America last year, and it's getting worse for now. But for us making decisions back here, infection rates are the crucial fact. And I've shown you the comparative numbers there. The right of returning citizens is the government's crucial responsibility. Blocking Australians from coming home should only be a last resort in the most extreme of circumstances. And that's not now, and especially not just from one country out of many hit hard by the pandemic. Also, what about the Australian Human Rights Council? Where were they when people were arrested in their own homes in Melbourne for opposing lockdowns? Where was the Human Rights Council when kids couldn't go to school, businesses were closed and people couldn't have their weddings? Where were they when people couldn't cross state borders for their parents' funerals? Where was the Human Rights Commission when sick people and expectant mothers were blocked from their closest hospitals by state government border closures? Where was the Human Rights Commission when people returning to Australia via Sydney then weren't allowed to continue on to their home thanks to state border closures? Well, they were nowhere, of course. All the usual defenders of human rights fell silent as the states clamped down on people in this country. But now they've got a coalition federal government to bash. They've suddenly found their voice.
The Universal Declaration on Human Rights says that people have the right to return to their own country. And that right really matters when you get caught up in a crisis and you're a long way from home. And that's why we're so worried about this new law. There are about 9,000 Australians who are desperately trying to escape the COVID crisis in India, and they want to come home. And what this law would do is it would make it a criminal offence for them to try and come home to Australia.
Yep, I agree with him. You know that. But I've been consistent, railing against overreach by various governments all along. I think it's pretty weak to hear the Australian Human Rights Commission coming out now, bashing Canberra. They were struck mute when it came to Daniel Andrews, Mark McGowan, Stephen Marshall and Anastasia Palaszczuk. They're a waste of taxpayers' money.